How is it possible that a man whose creative DNA is embedded in over $100 million of music revenue died in a sterile, underfunded public hospital ward with less than $10 to his name? This is not merely a tragic end to a talented life. It is a mathematical anomaly that points toward a systemic, cold-blooded corporate crime. To understand the destruction of Nathaniel Greene, the visionary lead singer of the group Intro, we must look past the glittering velvet curtains of 1,990 seconds R&B and stare directly at the cold ledger sheets of the era's power players. In 1992, the landscape of music was forever altered by Mary J. Blige's debut masterpiece, What's the 411? Kenny Greene's genius is permanently etched into the credits of that album on tracks like Reminisce and Love No Limit. By any rational industry standard, a songwriter who crafts multiple triple platinum hits should be financially secured for a lifetime. Yet, while those records were dominating the global airwaves, internal sources and surviving peers from the New York scene reveal a hauntingly different reality. The man who built the throne was struggling to pay his monthly rent. This wasn't an accident of bad business, it was a legal liquidation. We are talking about the predatory work-for-hire agreements, the industry's favorite tool for intellectual harvesting. In these contracts, a young, hungry creator is often handed a modest cash advance in exchange for 100% of their publishing rights, effectively murdering their financial future before the ink even dries. While the public saw a rising star in a leather vest, the accounting departments at labels like Uptown Records saw a disposable service provider who had signed away his birthright. For every dollar generated by his soul-stirring melodies, the corporate machinery ensured that only microscopic fractions ever reached Kenny's pocket. The industry didn't just fail Kenny. They conducted a surgical extraction of his identity. They took his vulnerability, his intricate church-bred harmonies, and his streetwise poeticism, and they converted them into a profitable brand that was far more marketable than the sensitive man behind the curtain. But this heist didn't stop at the money. As Kenny's health began to decline under the terrifying shadow of a taboo diagnosis in a hyper-masculine culture, the system didn't offer a lifeline, it activated an exit strategy. This video is an autopsy of that betrayal. We are going to deconstruct the predatory contracts, trace the missing royalty streams, and expose the cold-hearted abandonment by those who called him brother while spending the millions he earned for them. Kenny Greene didn't just fade away. He was legally and historically erased by design. Why has the name Kenny Greene been treated like a radioactive secret in the halls of music history for over 2 decades? The silence, following his passing in 2001, wasn't a collective lapse in memory. It was a strategic, corporate-mandated deletion. The major labels and the A-list icons who once built their legacies on the strength of his pen have maintained a convenient form of amnesia, hoping that the statute of limitations on our collective memory would eventually run out. They understand a dangerous truth. If Kenny Greene is properly honored and his story is told in full, the predatory labels as Landlord's model must be called into question. They fear that if we compare his empty bank accounts to his platinum plaques, the so-called golden era of R&B begins to look less like a cultural triumph and more like a gilded cage. In this investigative deep dive, we are officially breaking the industry's most sacred and sinister law, the code of silence. We aren't here merely to mourn a fallen talent. We are here to perform a forensic audit of a stolen life. We are going to ask the uncomfortable questions that Hollywood has spent 20 years trying to bury. Why did the queen of hip-hop soul and the high-level executives at the top of the industry food chain choose cold, professional distance over basic human compassion when Kenny was gasping for his final breaths in a public hospital ward? Was their withdrawal truly about the stigma of his illness, or was it a calculated fear that a dying man with nothing left to lose might finally reveal the predatory mechanics of their success? To the audience of The Human Equation, I'm asking you to look past the nostalgia and pay close attention to the structural details. We have cross-referenced the timeline of his global hits against the documented timeline of his personal poverty. We have examined the recoupable expenses, the industry's legal term for debt traps that kept Kenny in a state of permanent financial deficit while his songs were topping the Billboard charts. Once you witness the cold mechanics of how Kenny Greene was muted and then deleted from his own legacy, you will never be able to listen to 90 Seconds R&B with the same innocence again. This is more than a story. It is a confrontation. We are naming the names, we are highlighting the numbers, and we are demanding to know who is still profiting from Kenny Greene's ghost. The era of marketable lies ends today. The audit of his life starts now. To truly uncover the mechanics of the heist against Kenny Greene, we must examine the sonic architecture of 1992, the year the world met the queen of hip-hop soul. When you analyze Mary J. Blige's What's the 411, you aren't just looking at an album. You are looking at a blueprint designed by a ghost. Kenny Greene's fingerprints are all over the DNA of that record, most notably on Reminisce and Love No Limit. But the industry's deception lies in the distinction between contribution and ownership. In the predatory climate of Uptown Records, a creator like Kenny was often utilized as a vocal producer and ghost arranger. This meant he wasn't just writing lyrics on a yellow notepad. He was in the booth for 18 hours a day, literally sculpting the vocal identity of the artists the label wanted to promote. He taught them the phrasing, the emotional breaks, and the soul that would eventually sell millions of copies. However, the paper trail tells a story of systematic exclusion. While the stars were positioned as the voice of a generation, Kenny was funneled into work-for-hire status. Under these legal arrangements, a songwriter is paid a flat, one-time fee often disguised as a generous advance in exchange for signing away their long-term publishing rights and mechanical royalties. For the label, this is the ultimate profit multiplier. They pay a few $1,000s up front to own a piece of intellectual property that will generate millions in passive income through radio airplay, international distribution, and eventual streaming. We have to ask, why was a man responsible for the melodies that defined 1992 not seeing the mailbox money that usually follows a triple platinum success? The answer is found in the recoupable debt system. The industry operates on a bank model where every penny spent on a music video, a stylist, or a studio session is considered a loan to the artist. Even if Kenny had kept a percentage of his points, the label's accountants ensured those points were eaten up by overhead before they ever reached his hands. He was essentially a high-end contractor building a mansion for a landlord who would never allow him to spend a single night in the guest room. By the time the world was singing his hooks at the top of their lungs, Kenny was already being squeezed out of the financial equation. They didn't just borrow his talent, they harvested his soul, packaged it into a more televisual face, and used a labyrinth of legal jargon to ensure the creator stayed hungry while the middlemen stayed wealthy. This wasn't a partnership. It was an industrial-scale extraction of black brilliance, conducted in broad daylight under the guise of standard business practice. The question that inevitably arises when looking at this wreckage is, why didn't Kenny Greene sue? Why didn't he take his case to the courts and reclaim the millions being siphoned from his genius? To understand his silence, you have to understand the Mafia doctrine of the 1990 seconds music industry. Kenny wasn't just facing a few greedy executives, he was up against a multi-billion-dollar legal fortress designed to crush dissent. The contracts he signed were often cross-collateralized. This is a predatory accounting trick where the label links multiple projects together, meaning the profits from a hit song by intro were used to pay off the debts of a failed music video or a marketing campaign that Kenny Anycations had no control over. He was trapped in a cycle of perpetual debt, where no matter how many records he sold, the balance sheet always bled red. Beyond the numbers, there was the terrifying reality of industry blacklisting. In the 90 seconds, 3 or 4 major players controlled the gates to every radio station, retail shelf, and music television slot in the country. If Kenny had dared to challenge the queen of hip-hop soul's credits or demand an audit of Uptown Records, his career would have been terminated with a single phone call. The industry elite functioned like a cartel. They protected their stars and their brands at all costs because those were their primary cash cows. For a sensitive creator like Kenny, the threat wasn't just financial, it was the threat of total professional excommunication. He was made to feel that he was lucky to even be in the room, a psychological tactic used by labels to keep their most valuable ghostwriters in a state of permanent submission. Furthermore, the legal fees required to challenge a major label are astronomical. A man who is struggling to pay rent cannot afford the retainer for a high-powered entertainment lawyer to go up against a corporate legal team that is literally being paid with the royalties they are withholding from him. It is the ultimate catch-22. You need the money to sue for the money they stole. Kenny was forced into a submissive role, knowing that if he bit the hand that fed him crumbs, those crumbs would vanish, leaving him to starve in an industry that had already moved on to the next trend. The labels didn't just own his songs, they owned his silence. They utilized a standard of intimidation that ensured geniuses like Kenny Greene stayed in the shadows, producing platinum hits for their masters, while being legally prohibited from ever claiming the throne they had built with their own sweat and tears. This was not a fair market. It was a high-tech plantation where the crop was soul and the owners held all the whips. By 1993, the industry had decided that Kenny Greene's musical genius was merely a raw material. To maximize profit, they needed to manufacture a marketable facade. This was the birth of the Golden Cage. When the group intro was launched, the executives at Uptown Records didn't want the world to see the sensitive, poetic, and deeply introspective man that Kenny actually was. Instead, they forced him into a pre-packaged template of hyper-masculinity. They draped him in oversized leather, heavy boots, and a rugged bad boy persona that was meticulously designed to appeal to the aggressive aesthetic of early 90 Seconds New York. This was a systematic assassination of his true character. The label wasn't selling his soul. They were selling a caricature of black manhood that was deemed safe and profitable for the charts. The evidence of this identity theft is visible in every promotional photo and music video from that era. Kenny, a man whose lyrical depth suggested a sophisticated vulnerability, was directed to perform a choreographed version of dominance. He was forced to play a role that was entirely alien to his spirit, acting as the R&B heartthrob, while his true identity remained locked in a corporate vault. This wasn't artistic development, it was a strategic gag order. The industry understood that in the hyper-masculine world of 90 seconds, hip-hop and R&B, authenticity was a product to be faked, not a reality to be lived. They feared that if Kenny's true nature, his sensitivity, his complexity, and his private struggles were ever exposed, it would devalue the brand they had spent millions to build. Think about the psychological toll of living a double life under the glare of global stardom. Kenny was an architect of emotion who was legally prohibited from showing his own face. Every time he stepped onto a stage to perform hits like Love Thang, he was participating in a lie sanctioned by a contract. He was a prisoner of his own success, caught in a system where the face belonged to the label and only the labor belonged to him. The tragedy of this era wasn't just that Kenny wasn't paid his worth. It was that he was forced to kill parts of himself every single day just to stay relevant in a marketplace that despised the man but worshipped the voice. They turned a visionary into a static product, ensuring that by the time the public realized who Kenny Greene really was, the industry had already moved on to their next authentic puppet. While Kenny Greene was being marketed as a symbol of peak physical virility, he was privately navigating a double pressure that was slowly crushing his spirit. By the mid-90 seconds, the shadow of HIV began to darken his life. But in the hyper-masculine, often homophobic ecosystem of 90 seconds R&B, a diagnosis wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a professional death sentence. Kenny was forced to live in a state of constant, exhausting performance. He had to maintain the bad boy facade on stage while his immune system was failing in the dressing room. This was the era of don't ask, don't tell in the music industry. The labels didn't want to hear about his pain. They only wanted to hear the high notes. They pressured him to keep the mask on, fearing that any sign of vulnerability or illness would instantly evaporate the group's commercial appeal and ruin their investment. The sheer cruelty of this forced deception is documented in the grueling tour schedules he was expected to maintain. Can you imagine the psychological and physical torture of being ravaged by a virus, yet being ordered to caked on thick layers of stage makeup to hide the lesions and the growing fatigue? Kenny was literally dying in plain sight, yet he was forced to sing about everlasting love to satisfy a market that would have turned its back on him in a heartbeat if they knew the truth. The industry leaders didn't see a human being in need of medical leave and compassion. They saw a depreciating asset that needed to be squeezed for every last drop of profit before it expired. They prioritized the comfort of the record-buying public over the life of the man who was generating their wealth. This forced silence was more than a privacy choice. It was a form of institutionalized isolation. By keeping his struggle a secret to protect the intro brand, Kenny was denied the communal support and the open medical advocacy that could have provided him with better treatment options. He was a prisoner of the very image the label had built for him. Every time he stepped onto a tour bus, he was betraying his own body to save the label's bottom line. The phobia of the 1,990 seconds acted as a second invisible cage. It ensured that Kenny Greene stayed alone in his suffering, terrified that if he reached out for help, the industry gatekeepers would quarantine his career. They traded his health for marketability, ensuring that he remained a profitable secret until the moment he was no longer useful. This was the ultimate price of the golden cage. You were allowed to be a star, but you were never allowed to be a human in need. The true, shivering cold of the music industry reveals itself not in the shadows of the studio, but in the sterile silence of a crisis. By the late 1,990 seconds, the money machine that was intro began to stall as Kenny Greene's physical health reached a definitive breaking point. This is where the narrative shifts from mere exploitation to absolute moral bankruptcy. For years, the record labels had feasted on Kenny's genius, growing wealthy off the compounding interest of his songwriting and the soulful precision of his vocal arrangements. But the moment the corporate accountants realized their prime asset was no longer capable of enduring the grueling, profit-driven demands of touring and promotion, the warmth of the industry vanished instantly. To the executives in their high-rise offices, Kenny Greene was no longer a human being with a life worth saving. He was a depreciating piece of hardware that had become too expensive to maintain. They didn't see a founding father of their current sound. They saw a liability that needed to be struck from the balance sheet to protect the quarterly margins. The betrayal was swift, calculated, and devastatingly professional. Almost overnight, the vital financial infrastructure that Kenny relied on, the very money he had earned through his platinum contributions, was severed. The industry had spent years marketing his vulnerability for profit, yet they found his actual physical vulnerability to be unmarketable. Think about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of this transition. At the exact moment Kenny required his health insurance, his accumulated royalties, and his industry connections to navigate a life-threatening illness, the gatekeepers initiated a total blackout. They didn't just stop the marketing campaigns. They effectively cut him off from the medical resources necessary for survival. While his compositions were still being broadcast across the country, generating passive income for the labels every single hour of every single day, Kenny was struggling to afford the basic antiretroviral medications that were his only hope for a future. This was a death sentence signed in a boardroom under the guise of fiscal responsibility. The labels possessed the wealth of empires, much of it built on the uncompensated labor of black creators like Kenny, yet they refused to spare even a microscopic fraction of those profits to provide him with a dignified fighting chance. They treated him like a used-up battery, discarded in the trash the second it lost its charge, despite the fact that the energy he provided was still powering their industry. This is the industry standard that is never discussed in the glossy pages of music magazines. You are a king as long as you can produce, but you are a ghost the moment you bleed. The abandonment was total, and the silence from the executive suites was the loudest signal of all they were, simply waiting for the creator to disappear so they could stop acknowledging the debt they owed him. If the corporate abandonment of Kenny Greene was a cold business calculation, the silence from his peers was a spiritual assassination. In the 90 seconds R&B scene, Family was a word thrown around in every award speech and every liner note. They shared the same stages, the same producers, and the same intimate creative struggles. But the moment the whispers about Kenny's health began to circulate through the industry grapevine, that brotherhood evaporated like a ghost. Many of the superstars who occupied the top of the charts, artists whose very careers were built on the melodic foundations and vocal arrangements Kenny had gifted them, suddenly suffered from a convenient form of amnesia. They were happy to ride the wave of his genius when it meant platinum success, but they treated him like a social leper the moment his tide began to recede into the shadows of illness. The cowardice displayed by these icons is a permanent stain on the history of the genre. You have to understand the immense power these people held. A single public statement of support from a Mary J. Blige or a high-profile industry peer could have forced the labels to act, or at the very least, raised the funds for the specialized care Kenny so desperately needed. Instead, they chose the path of professional preservation. They feared that being associated with a man dying of a stigmatized disease would tarnish their own curated images of street credibility and sexual virility. It is a nauseating irony. They were singing ballads about everlasting loyalty, using the very vocal techniques Kenny had taught them, while simultaneously deleting his number from their contact lists to avoid brand contamination. This was not a mere lack of friendship, it was a systematic desertion by an entire community. When Kenny needed the collective influence of the R&B elite to demand better treatment from the predatory labels, he found himself standing in an empty room. These icons were the primary beneficiaries of his soul, yet they acted like strangers when his humanity was on the line. The few who did maintain contact often did so in the shadows, as if supporting a dying friend was a shameful secret they had to hide from their fans and their publicists. This betrayal proved that in the music machine, loyalty is just a profitable lyric, not a lived value. They didn't just leave Kenny Greene to die. They allowed him to be forgotten while he was still breathing, ensuring that the man who had provided the soundtrack to their glory was left with nothing but the echoes of his own genius. Their collective silence was a second death sentence, written in the ink of absolute indifference. By the turn of the millennium, the man who had been the architect of the R&B revolution was reduced to a patient number in a crowded, underfunded public hospital ward in New York City. This is the stage of the story that the music industry has spent 20 years trying to scrub from the historical record. Imagine the staggering cognitive dissonance of this scene. While Kenny Greene's voice was being broadcast into millions of homes, cars, and headphones, generating royalties with every play, the man himself was lying in a sterile bed, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the silence of the forgotten. There were no platinum plaques on these peeling walls. There were only mounting medical bills and the terrifying reality that he was being forced to die in the very poverty he had spent his entire career trying to escape. But the most damning evidence of the industry's predatory nature was that even on his deathbed, Kenny Greene never stopped working. He couldn't afford to. Because the labels were withholding his back royalties and his health insurance had been strategically liquidated, Kenny was forced to write lyrics and arrange harmonies while hooked up to IV drips and heart monitors. He was literally selling the last sparks of his creative fire to pay for a few more hours of oxygen. Think about the sheer, unadulterated inhumanity of that dynamic. The industry had exhausted his youth, exploited his prime, and now they were waiting like vultures for him to produce one last hit before his time ran out. He was ghostwriting for his own funeral expenses, pouring his final, fading strength into verses that other, healthier artists would eventually profit from. This wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a state of permanent corporate exile. Kenny Greene was a prisoner of a system that had already found his replacement. The nurses in that overworked ward didn't know they were tending to a musical king. They only saw a broken man with almost no visitors and zero resources. The silence of his telephone was a constant, ringing reminder of the loyalty he had been promised during the years of champagne and tour buses. He was an architect who had built mansions for everyone else, yet he didn't even have the dignity of a private room to die in. The stigma of his condition acted as a psychological barrier that even his most famous collaborators refused to cross, leaving him to face the abyss alone. This is the final, ugly truth of the entertainment machine. You are only family as long as you are a functional profit center. Once you break, you become invisible, a ghost long before you even stop breathing. It is a convenient and comfortable lie to say that AIDS was the sole cause of Kenny Greene's death. While the virus ravaged his physical body, it was the calculated systemic stigma of the 1,990 seconds that actually extinguished his spirit. In that era, a diagnosis wasn't treated as a medical battle. It was used as a moral weapon to justify the total abandonment of the inconvenient. Kenny wasn't merely a patient in need of care. He was treated as a social pariah, a man whose very existence threatened the hyper-masculine, polished facade of the R&B industry. The corporate gatekeepers didn't see a tragedy, they saw a branding catastrophe. They weaponized the prevailing phobias of the time to justify their own cowardice, effectively quarantining Kenny's career, while they continued to harvest the royalties from his past work. This wasn't a lack of scientific understanding. It was a surplus of human cruelty. The psychological warfare of this era's stigma acted as a secondary death sentence long before his heart stopped beating. Imagine the immense, soul-crushing trauma of being a global icon of love and connection while realizing that the very audience you sang for and the executives you made wealthy would recoil in visceral fear at the thought of shaking your hand. The labels understood that in a marketplace fueled by a toxic brand of virility, Kenny's truth was a liability that could devalue their assets. Consequently, they chose to bury the man long before the body was cold. They didn't just ignore his medical needs. They participated in the erasure of his identity to keep the brand of intro pristine and profitable. This wasn't protection. It was a corporate liquidation of a human soul. Every time a major media outlet chose to ignore his struggle, and every time a high-profile collaborator refused to step into that hospital ward, they were adding another brick to the wall of his isolation. This social quarantine was a form of living death that the industry sanctioned, encouraged, and enforced. Kenny Greene was forced to exist in a vacuum where his genius was celebrated on the airwaves every hour, but his humanity was treated as a dirty, unspeakable secret in the boardrooms. The phobia of the 90 seconds didn't just steal his health. It stole his right to a legacy while he was still present to witness the theft. It allowed the world to pretend he had already vanished, while they continued to hum the tunes he had carved out of his own suffering. We must be clear. The industry didn't fail Kenny Greene because of a biological virus. They failed him because they lacked the basic human courage to stand by a man who was no longer profitable. The true killer wasn't just an infection, it was the absolute indifference of a society that valued the brand more than the creator. When Kenny Greene finally drew his last breath in October 2001, at the age of only 32, the music industry's response was a chilling, organized silence. There were no televised tributes on MTV or BET, no star-studded benefit concerts, and no public outpourings of grief from the icons who had built their mansions on the foundation of his melodic genius. The funeral of the man who co-founded Intro and architected the sound of Mary J. Blige was a stark, lonely affair that functioned as a final, brutal insult. While the world was busy chasing the next commercial trend, the man who had paved the way for the R&B revolution was buried with the quiet indifference usually reserved for a stranger. This wasn't just a lack of professional respect, it was a strategic decision to ensure his narrative died with him. The industry didn't want a public memorial because a memorial would raise uncomfortable forensic questions about how a platinum-selling artist ended up in a situation of such extreme medical and financial neglect. The cowardice of the superstars at this moment was absolute and documented by their absence. Where were the artists who once claimed they couldn't find their vibe without Kenny's vocal coaching? Where were the high-powered executives who had toasted to his platinum plaques in the luxury offices of Uptown Records? Their absence from his funeral was a calculated PR move to protect their personal brands from the stigma that Kenny carried. By staying away, they were effectively confirming the industry's verdict, that Kenny Greene's life was no longer a valuable asset. They wanted his body buried quickly and quietly, so the collective conscience of the industry wouldn't be disturbed by the reality of their betrayal. The media, too, acted as an accomplice in this erasure, treating his passing as a minor, insignificant footnote rather than the loss of a musical titan. They chose to ignore the tragic arc of his final years because the truth that a genius had been bled dry of his intellectual property and then discarded didn't fit the glossy, aspirational narrative they sold to the public. This silent funeral was the industry's ultimate thank you to the man who gave them everything. They took his hits, they took his publishing, and finally, they took away his right to be remembered as a pioneer. By refusing to show up, they attempted to rewrite history, making it seem as though the iconic sounds of the 90 seconds had simply materialized out of thin air, rather than being carved out of the soul and the suffering of Kenny Greene. The story of Kenny Greene is not just a tragic chapter in the history of R&B, it is an ongoing financial and moral crime that we are witnessing in real time. Every time you stream, reminisce, every time a radio station plays Love No Limit, or every time a documentary uses a clip of intro, the industry continues to extract profit from a man they left to die in a public ward. The royalties are still flowing, the publishing checks are still being generated, but the central question remains, who is currently sitting on Kenny Greene's money? While his family struggled to afford a headstone, the corporate gatekeepers were busy reinvesting the wealth he created. This is the ultimate betrayal a creator, whose work is immortalized in the digital cloud, but whose personhood was treated as disposable waste. We cannot rewrite the past, and we cannot heal the wounds inflicted in that hospital bed, but we can refuse to allow his name to remain a footnote in the portfolios of the men who betrayed him. We owe it to the ghost architect of soul to demand a restoration of his legacy. We must stop allowing the superstars to take 100% of the credit for the emotions that Kenny Greene meticulously crafted in the shadows. This is a call to action for every fan of music and every believer in human justice. Do not let the industry's strategic silence win. Share his name, play his music with the full awareness of the sacrifice he made, and force the world to acknowledge that the golden era was built on the back of a man they tried to bury twice, once in the earth and once in the archives of forgotten history. Kenny Greene did not just write songs, he surrendered his identity until he had nothing left to give. The very least we can do is return his dignity. The next time you hear a harmony that feels too deep or a lyric that hits too close to home, remember the man in the public ward with the IV drip and the notepad. Remember the ghost in the machine who was forced to pay for his own oxygen with his last remaining sparks of genius. Kenny Greene is no longer here to audit the books, so we must be his accountants. The era of the marketable lie ends today. The reign of the rightful king begins now. We will not look away again.